Greetings. My name is Anthony. I am a storyteller, and a lot of storytellers will tell you that one of the most vital elements of a story is place, where that story is set. Today I want to explore the idea maybe it can also be important where, the place that you tell a story. I'm currently standing in Monument Avenue in the city of Richmond, the great capital of the state of Virginia. Also, the capital of the Confederacy back in the 1860s. Specifically, I am standing underneath the statue of Robert E. Lee, and I'm standing in front of it because here I think this place might be a good place to tell this story. When my brother Matt and I were growing up in Eastern Virginia, we came to realize there were two types of parent. There's a type of parent that Sunday after Sunday, they would take their children to Sunday school and church. Then there's the second type of parent that would send their children to Sunday school and church. We had that second type of parent. We heard rumor there was a third type of parent where nobody went to church, but we weren't allowed to know anybody like that. However, I was that little kid that was not going to let my parents get away with it. Every Sunday, I'd be right in front of my mom, and I'd be going 100 miles an hour. I'd be going, how come we have to go? How come we have to go? How come you don't have to go? How come we have to go? And she'd say, now, Anthony, we talked about this. Ray, fix this tie, Ray. Tell him why we don't have to go to church. I'd go see my dad. He'd say, now, son, we talked about this. As a kid, your gas tank is full. My dad, auto mechanic his entire life. And I think he understood the world better than most people, but if he was going to explain that world to you, it was usually in terms of a car. He'd say, son, now when me and your mama were kids, we always had to go to Sunday school, always had to go to church, but now as adults, our tank is full. I'd say, well, Grandma and Pop still go, Grandma and Pop still go. He'd say, well, yeah, Grandma and Pop still go, but as you get older, it's always a good idea to go back and top off. I'd say, top off? Why you got to top off? He said, well, because as you get older, you start to lose your religion. I said, well, what makes you lose your religion? This is usually when my mom would jump back in. She'd say, having kids? Now get out there. Grandma and Pop be here in a minute. We would head outside. Grandma and Pop would pull up in this old green Dodge. We'd hop in. They'd make a right turn out of Patrick's Creek Road, go down to Dare Road, make a left turn, past the Methodist Church where I went to first grade, and a little further up on the right were the ruins, the remains, the remnants of this old schoolhouse where Grandma used to teach. And either Pop or Grandma would say, that's where Grandma used to teach. We don't know why they did that. Anytime we were in the car with an adult, they were going to say, that's where Grandma used to teach. And besides, on that property was a dangerous, open, don't you kids dare go near it, well. So naturally, my brother and I knew exactly where that piece of property was. There was a good chance we had thrown half of York County down into that well. But you would pass that spot going into the town of Grafton. There you would pass Amory Funeral Home. Been there years and years. You would pass Grafton Garage, where my grandfather always bought his Dodges. From there, you would head to Grafton Christian Church. Pop would park under the same tree, Sunday after Sunday. And as a kid, you start to realize that life has certain rituals to it. As soon as we got out of that car, we were going to hear three words from Grandfather Pop. Y'all got money? We love to hear it, and we hated to hear it. We loved to hear it because it's our grandfather showing he cared for us, but we hated to hear it because that often meant we had forgotten to get our dollar from our dad. Back then, the going Sunday school rate to entertain kids for an hour, slip in some religion, that was $1. All kids brought $1. So if we said, oh, Pop, we forgot our money, he'd reach into his pocket, pull out this ancient leather change purse, crack it open, first coin he saw. Matt, dime for you. Anthony, nickel for you. Thanks, Pop. We'd head inside, try to slide it between the bills so it wouldn't clink when it hit the plate. But after Sunday school, it was time for what we called big church. Pop would sit, fourth pew back, left side, beside the window. Grandma next to him, then me, then my brother Matt. Now I'll be honest, in big church, we didn't always as kids understand what was going on. However, one thing did amaze me, amazes me to this day. For the entire hour, my brother and I would just sit there and behave. And I'd look around at all the other kids, they would be behaving too. This has bothered me for years and years. I have come up with two possible explanations. Number one, it was an actual church miracle. Number two, ADD, ADHD had not been invented yet. Wouldn't even know we could misbehave. But after big church, the time to get back in the car, past Amy's funeral home, past the old schoolhouse, get home, get dropped off, run inside, change out of our Sunday clothes into our play clothes, back outside on our bikes, down Patrick's Creek Road to our grandfather's farm. And they had this old farmhouse, and I use the word old because parts of it were built before the Civil War, back when this man here was alive. And I say parts because it just looked like it had been added on to 100 times, and no other part matched any other part. But we would leave our bikes there in the yard, walk up this little skinny concrete sidewalk. On the left, pretty green grass. On the right was this fine white sand you see all over eastern Virginia. But we knew not to walk through there, because up under there, oyster shells. Dozens and dozens of oyster shells, and we rarely wore shoes back then. You wouldn't walk through there. And if you took the time to look, up under the back porch, hundreds, if not thousands of oyster shells. And there by the back step, something you don't see much anymore, the silver-colored aluminum box, the dairy cooler for the milkman to leave his delivery. But you entered the house through the back porch, and when you opened that back porch door into the kitchen, there it was, set out in front of you, Sunday dinner. Now friends, I'm not talking about Sunday supper, Sunday breakfast, or Sunday brunch, or Sunday lunch. I'm talking about Sunday dinner, the way it should be. 2 plates, one heaped over with fried chicken, the other a good salty Smithfield ham. Beside that, you're going to have the vegetables fresh from the garden, string beans, butter beans, corn, and carrots. Beside that, you're going to have the greens, all cooked in ham grease the way they should be. Cabbage and collards and turnip greens and spinach. And beside that, you're going to have the canned goods. Pickled peaches, pickled pear, pickled watermelon, pickled cucumber. Grandma's rule on that farm, if it didn't move, she pickled it, stuck it into a jar of vinegar. My favorite of those, usually a little smaller jar, something called chow chow. I met some folks don't know what chow chow is. A relish so good you would never waste it on a hot dog. And then, my favorite part of the meal, usually beside the chow chow, in a little tiny clear glass crystal cut cruet of vinegar, there it was. Because what you would do, you would take your cabbage and your collards and put them on your plate. Take your knife, slide it up the other side of your plate. Add that vinegar. You've now created that vinegar floodplain so it doesn't back up into the rest of your food. Now you take this meal I just described. You set beside it a tall glass of fresh brewed sweet iced tea. You are in heaven, and you didn't have to die or behave to get there. That's how Sunday dinner should be. In the 10 minutes it had taken us to change our clothes and ride down there, Grandma had laid out this amazing meal. She did that Sunday after Sunday. That was her job. She did it very well. Pop had 3 jobs. Pop said grace. No one said grace but Pop. Job number 2, he cut the ham. Nobody else cut the ham but Pop. Job number 3, he was the storyteller. He was the entertainer for us kids. I want to give you an idea of Pop's sense of humor. Now when I was a little kid, I was that little kid that could not pronounce any word with the letter R. I would stick in a W, I really would. That's how I would talk. I was about that age when something happened, never happened before. I reached for the little cruet of vinegar. It was empty. I said, Grandma, we're out of vinegar. She says, well, land sakes, child, I didn't know that. Let me go into the pantry and get you some more. Now, I bet a lot of folks today, especially kids, don't know what a pantry is. Pantry, that room at your grandparents' house behind the kitchen that is just stocked full of food in case the depression ever comes back. And we hear her back there looking, and finally she says, Howard, I thought there was some vinegar. Do you know where there's some vinegar? And my grandfather began to smile. He said, Aline, look on the bottom shelf in the back. And then you hear, well, land sakes, I didn't know that was there. And she came out, she is carrying the clear glass gallon jug of vinegar, back when it had a cork, not a little metal spinny top. And she is so careful, I'm watching her, she's so careful pouring that into the cruet over the sink. I'm watching her, but I'm also watching Pop. Pop is now grinning like a possum with a pound of persimmons, and I should have paid more attention. But finally she hands me that cruet. Here you are, sweetie. I took it, poured it all over my cabbage, stuck my fork in there, put it in my mouth. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but that fork transformed. It turned into a pair of jumper cables. They clamped down on my tongue. The other end was hooked to the revving engine of an F-16 fighter jet. My body stiffened out, and Grandma said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Now, some of you listening have already figured it out. To play a joke on me, my grandfather was willing to give up his hiding spot, his hiding place for his whiskey, his moonshine, his hooch. And so Grandma's saying, "Anthony, what's wrong?" I says, "It's Watton. It's Watton vinegar." She says, "No, child, that's brand new. I just opened it." I said, "It's Watton." She said, "Sweetie, it was full to the top." And then she said something I couldn't argue with. She says, "Honey, it must be your imagination." And I thought for a second. Every report card I had ever brought home always had the same two words: active imagination. I thought, had to be my imagination. Nobody in their right mind would create something that tasted like this. So using my good kid brain logic, I had an even bigger bite. Now, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, if you remember what those are, or Wikipedia, according to the encyclopedia, there's over 5,000 taste buds on the human tongue. All of a sudden, there was a mass suicide inside my mouth. My inside started burning and turning over and over. I began to sweat from places I didn't know humans could sweat. And what was left of my tongue was now beating itself against the side of my mouth. I thought trying to knock itself out. Now through my glazed eyes, I look over, I see Pop rolling out of his chair laughing. I see Grandma's finger coming up out of that cruet to have a taste. I said, "No, Grandma, it's Watton vinegar." To this day, I can't go to a family reunion or a family supper without somebody offering me Watton vinegar. Now, a long time ago, back before television, grandparents belonged to these things called lodges. And it seemed like Pop belonged to about 6 or 7 different lodges, so sometimes on a Sunday, he would be gone. And the job of storyteller would go to our grandma. And we'd say, "Grandma, tell us a story, tell us a story." And she'd tell that one fib that sometimes grandmas tell. She'd say, "I don't know any stories." In our brains, we're thinking, "You were a school teacher for 100 years. You've got the best stories." And so finally we'd say, "Well, tell us about the time you came to the old schoolhouse." This was a story that we had heard from our uncles dozens of times, heard from our dad a million times, but to hear her story from her was a rare treat. Her maiden name was Cora Aline Gwen. She grew up on a place called Gwen's Island, right off the coast of Matthews County, where it meets the Chesapeake Bay. In some ways, it's barely an island. There's a little creek that goes between there and the mainland, not far across. The old timers call that the hole in the wall, the place where the water goes through, and you can pretty much throw a rock from one side to the other. But that's where she grew up. It's also important when she grew up. Back where and when she grew up, you were going to be, if you were a young lady, you were going to be a farmer's wife. That's just how the world worked. However, I think she wanted something different for herself. Not better, just different. she went up to Mary Washington Teacher College up in Fredericksburg, back then called the Normal School. She did really well. She came home, and I think her father, my great-grandfather, he knew somebody in Matthews County, or he had some sway, because there was a brand new schoolhouse on the mainland across from the island. She got a job teaching there right out of school. This worked so well for her because she could stay at home, save some money. In the morning, just get up, walk across the island. Back then they had something called a pull ferry, a series of ropes. You pull yourself back and forth across the water, the hole in the wall. She gets to the mainland, walk on to school. Now, it was early fall, weather was still hot, and she was home on a Friday night. Her family had gone off, her mom and dad. She was home, and she heard a noise, a commotion, down at the beach at the hole in the wall. This was not unusual on a Friday night. Usually some men would go down there, and they would start a fire, roast some oysters, get a little liquored up, but no trouble ever came of it. But this week is different. You can always tell when something sounds wrong. So she walked down there, and sure enough, there was the men and the fire and the oysters and the liquor. But this time, out in the water, was a man named Tom Purley. Tom Purley was the last black man, the last African American on Gwen's Island. And those men, they had taken Tom and they had tied him to a post in the middle of that water. And they were taking bets on when the tide would cover his face. Grandma ran back to her house. She got her father's butcher knife. She came back to the beach, and the men saw her coming, and they stood in her way. They said, "Yeah, where do you think you're going with that knife? Where do you think you're going with that knife?" And she said, with more courage than I've ever had in my entire life, she said, "I didn't bring this knife just to cut his ropes." And they backed away. Now, she did go down in the water and cut Tom loose. Tom, very wisely, he swam off to the other side, disappeared up in the trees. Grandma came back up on her side, and the men were laughing at her. They were teasing her. She went home, tried to put it out of her mind, did tell her dad when he got home what had happened, and I think her father realized this might not be the end of it. Monday morning, she got up, walked across the island, took the pull ferry to work. She's walking up to the schoolhouse, and there was a man sitting on the steps, a man wearing a suit. As she got closer, he stood up. He said, "Eileen Gwen?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I'm afraid you don't work here anymore." She went home, told her father what had happened. I think he was ready. Put all their stuff in a wagon. They went south across Matthews County, south across Gloucester County, across the York River, into York County, into the little town of Grafton. I think my great-grandfather chose Grafton for a reason. Not far from there was a new school that needed a school teacher. Now, in Grafton, you had several large families. One large family was the Amory family. They had the funeral home, still there today. They also had a boarding house, took in my grandmother, and they also had a soda bottling plant. Not there anymore. They sold off their sugar rations in World War II to the bigger companies. But Grandma took up in the boarding house, and at night she would work at the bottling plant late into the night. But early in the morning she had to get up, walk to school, start the fire before the kids got there. Now that walk to school, about a mile maybe, there was no paved road. It was a dirt road through the woods. And one morning she's walking through there, dark as can be, and a man jumped out of the bushes. He ran up and he grabbed her and he hugged her and he squeezed her and he's lifting her feet off the ground and he is screaming, "Fo God, fo God, it's Henry Gwen's daughter." Tom Purley had also migrated to York County, had a shack off Dare Road, was now doing odd jobs around the county. But right now, he's yelling at my grandma. He's yelling, "Gal, what you doing coming through here in the dark like this? What do you think you're doing? You shouldn't be doing that." And she explained she was the new school teacher. And Tom Purley, he said, "As long as I live, you will never walk down this road by yourself again." And she never did. She came out of school that afternoon. Tom was there. she came out of the boarding house the next morning, Tom was there. She would walk, he would follow. I would love to tell you that they walked side by side. It just didn't happen. That would have gotten them both into more trouble. Now the world always changes. My grandfather, Pop, was back from World War I. He started courting my grandma. One Friday night, he's down at the general store there in Grafton, and the men are teasing him. And they're saying, Howard, how come you keep coming around here, Howard? You never gonna marry this gal. How come you keep coming around? And this was so much like my grandfather. He said, men, you're never gonna tease me again. And he married her that night. Pop had a new farm down on Patrick's Creek where they went to live, but Pop also had a car. Grandma learned to drive. There was no more walking back and forth to school. All of a sudden, Grandma was again getting up early in the morning, but this time she was now a farmer's wife as well. Now, Tom continued doing odd jobs around the county. One of his jobs was he had a peck basket. He'd go around to the mud bogs and creeks of eastern Virginia digging for oysters. Even back then, you could take a peck of oysters to town and make some good money. Now, about once a week, Grandma would come downstairs early in the morning to get that milk delivery, and there by her back steps would be a large pile of fresh oysters. Tom never forgot that ritual of gratitude. With that, Grandma's story was over. She'd start cleaning up the Sunday dinner dishes. My brother and I would head down to the barnyard. We usually had a big kickball game Sunday afternoons down there with our cousins, but I knew if I ever came back to that house, I could look at those shelves, remember the story, and know where those shells came from. But more importantly, I could remember that story, look at those shells, and know where I came from. Friends, I want to end this story with a suggestion. Parents and grandparents, tell your children and grandchildren your stories. Let them know where they come from, because place is important. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope we meet again.